Welcome to Working for Women, the Independent Women's Forum podcast, where we are changing the conversation about women and public policy for the better.
Hello, I'm Sabrina Schaefer, Executive Director of the Independent Women's Forum, and welcome to another great edition of IWF's Working for Women podcast. I'm thrilled to talk to IWF's Managing Director, Carrie Lucas, today about a topic that many of us at IWF are especially interested in, childcare. Now, Carrie has 5 children of her own, so childcare is an issue that she thinks about with some frequency, and I have children as well, and so I think that we should have a very personal and policy strong conversation today. So let's jump right into it. Carrie, I know that there are a lot of working women who have young children and who require 2 earner households, and so they have to consider different child care arrangements. Before we get into some of the solutions, part of our conversation, can you give listeners a lay of the land? You know, I think there are some misperceptions out there about what kinds of child care arrangements people actually use.
Yeah, Sabrina, it really is. This is such an interesting and personal conversation, and I think when you're right, when we hear about it from a public policy standpoint, people may be under the impression that everybody uses paid child care, and particularly paid child care centers, when actually it's a really relatively small fraction of kids. About a quarter of kids who are under age 5 are in kind of the formal child care centers, which I feel like are the kind of the centerpiece of policy conversations and the focus of so much of the solutions that are presented by the left. But really, parents are often trying to keep a parent at home or another family member at home to care for kids, especially when their kids are young, or they use more informal arrangements, such as a babysitter down the street or another mom, sometimes for pay, sometimes for not. So it's a very varied kind of solutions that we have, and that's really important to keep in mind as we think about public policies to help ease the burden on parents.
That's so interesting, and it does go against what we sort of perceive of, the working mom putting her child in daycare and that's the end of the story, but it's really not like that, and especially probably because so many women don't have traditional work arrangements either. They might be piecing together different things that allow them to need sort of part-time care. So what do you think the biggest challenge working parents face? Is it a shortage of options? Is it that childcare has become too expensive? Obviously, cost is something that we all talk about in our households.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another. I think that there's also this a misperception that everyone is really unhappy with their child care arrangement, when actually surveys suggest that people generally feel like they have a good situation, and which makes cost. Everybody, of course, wishes that things weren't quite so expensive across the board. And I do think, it's certainly child care and paid daycare can be incredibly expensive. In some places, it varies by states, but in some places it costs more than the local public university, which is kind of jarring at first. But I think that that it's also important to keep in mind why child care is expensive. As you said, Sabrina, you and I know from experience that it takes a lot of work to care for a kid, especially a baby. So when you hear numbers where it costs $1,000 a month to care for a baby, or to put a baby into daycare, at first that sounds like a lot, and it certainly is a major expense. But when you think about it from the provider side, if you or I, if somebody was going to ask, hire one of us to take care of a baby, we would know from experience that taking care of an infant or a 1-year-old, that's a big job. That takes there's only so many babies or infants you can take care of, and child care workers need to be paid. They should be paid fairly. Yes, we want to make child care more affordable as possible. But it's never going to be cheap, and nor should it be, because it's a really important job and it requires a lot of skills, patience, knowledge, and time. We want to solve this problem, but in some ways, we have to be realistic about what the options are.
And certainly at the Independent Women's Forum, and we're thinking about both sides, the working mother's concerns, but also most child care providers are also women. And so we want to make sure that those women are being paid fairly, as you mentioned, and that they are in facilities that are clean, and that that these are
Absolutely.
sort of good child care arrangements. Obviously, this is an election year, and this is an issue that has come up already before the debates have started. Some in Washington are suggesting that we should be doing more to help working parents. We obviously think that there is something that Washington can do. But can you lay out sort of what the different approaches are, how maybe progressives and conservatives are looking at this challenge?
Yeah, and it's interesting. So Hillary Clinton has taken what you would kind of consider the standard approach from the Democrats' perspective, and that's to focus on subsidizing the use of paid daycare, particularly these large daycare, like formal daycare facilities. And then, interestingly, she wants to make those more affordable and to cap how much any family would have to spend on childcare based on a percentage of income, which is kind of, the details of it are still a little fuzzy. She hasn't explained exactly how this would work or how you would prove your income and when you would pay for this and get reimbursed, whether it's a tax event or how that would work. But then on the other side, she says she wants to increase how much child care workers are paid, so basically raise the minimum wage, which would of course push in the other direction and making child care more expensive. Presumably those costs would end up being passed on to taxpayers, but the details remain to be seen. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is that this is a focus on a government setting the price for child care and taxpayers picking up the bill, and really focusing that support on parents who use paid child care, particularly former paid child care daycare centers.
Before we even get into the issue of how sort of conservatives are responding and what perhaps a more liberty-minded approach might be, I had a conversation just this week with some women who don't have children. And very often it seems as though all of those families out there who don't have children, whose children are grown, are sort of left out of the conversation. Because when we talk about this sort of new tax burden being put on all Americans, of course we want to all care for our next generation, but it really does disproportionately impact some at the expense of others. Am I correct?
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I think that is kind of when we talk about women's issues and this focus on providing support for moms and working parents, you're absolutely right that it's in some ways these childless women. Remember, and some of them are childless women who aren't childless by choice. They either weren't able to have kids, never found the right partner. So I think there must be a frustration when we continuously think about adding more benefits, whether that's maternity leave benefits, taking paid time off to care for kids, or childcare subsidies. Absolutely, there has to be some frustration with that, and it's important to keep their interests in mind and make sure that the system's fair to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a better way, and something that IWF has been promoting through our new report, Working for Women, A Modern Agenda for Working Women, is how we can address the issue of childcare through tax credits and consolidating spending on children. Could you explain that a little bit more for our listeners so that that there is another side to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that I feel like as we try to focus on how best to help parents while still being fair to the different choices that people make, the best way to do that is to focus on making life more affordable, whether you use paid childcare or whether you make significant sacrifices to keep a parent at home. We've talked about, and in our report, we talk about trying to give parents, substantially increasing the amount of childcare tax credit that one gets. This would mean that people without a tax burden would end up receiving money back. So if you have a low income, you'd have more money in your pocket. And same for those with higher incomes, you'd still be able to take more. And I think it's fair. Kids are a big investment. They're important not just for individual families, but for society in general. So that's one way to help parents across the board. And as we look at the spending that parents or that our government is making on behalf of children, there are places where it makes so much more sense to stop kind of growing the bureaucracy and instead consolidating that and saying, okay, instead of that, we don't know if that's how you should do this. We don't know what situation you have. If you have a a nice aunt who would be able to care for your kids, or that you would be able to take a part-time job instead and stay home with your child. We're going to try to make it easier for whatever choice you make by giving you more money in your pocket to make those decisions for your family.
Yeah, and I think that's great, because one of the big things that we don't want Washington to do is to bias people toward one kind of child care arrangement over another. As you mentioned, if you live close to family and you have somebody who's able to help care for your children, that would be fantastic, right? But not all families have that option. But it seems like right now, when we subsidize a particular kind of child care, and namely daycare, that's not always without its own problems, right? There's some challenges with that.
Absolutely. I wrote a piece recently that looked at some of the research on daycare's impact on kids, and it raised a few alarm bells. And I'm somebody, as you know, I've used, my children, my youngest children have been in paid daycare at different times. So I understand that many people, daycare providers or a formal daycare center is the best option for them. But it's important that we're aware of some of this research, and that we don't make a giant leap and kind of push our people to make that choice over another choice. I think a lot of people intuitively think that kids are best cared for by someone who loves them. But when, if all of a sudden daycare became totally free, those stay-at-home moms or those grandparents are stepping up and helping care for babies, they would all of a sudden say, oh, okay, you can get you can just drop them off down the street for nothing. Well, then I guess I won't bother. I'll go do something else with my time. And that's really I think it would be an unfortunate outcome.
And I think, I don't know if all of our listeners know this, but Carrie spent 8 years with her family living in Europe. And that is a place where they subsidize child care. Am I correct?
Absolutely. They heavily subsidize it, and that's one reason why I ended up making that choice, because it was very inexpensive for the user. There's kind of a norm where everybody ends up using childcare for kids starting at about one, and so there was kind of a societal expectation and pressure to use it, which, it's just one of those, these public policies do have an impact. I should mention that's why I was very encouraged. I didn't know how Donald Trump would come out on this issue, but he did come out recently with his plan, and it focused on making child care expenses tax deductible, both for child care people who are using daycare, but then he also described wanting to make it so that families who are keeping a parent home also receive support and a tax break. And I do think that's really a positive direction, because that focuses on returning resources to parents rather than growing government. And I really think that's the best way we can help families.
And will that, Carrie, help a tax deduction? Will that help women across the board, no matter your income level?
Yes, we don't know exactly how Mr. Trump would structure this. If it's a tax deduction, then it doesn't apply against payroll taxes, then it wouldn't ultimately help those without a positive income tax liability. But I believe that he's indicated that he would make sure that tax deduction applied against payroll taxes, which the vast majority of workers do pay. They have to pay, so that it would help those with lower incomes, and that would mean that parents that we really want to help. I hope that's the direction he goes, because I think these are the parents that who are doing their best, working hard, and could deserve need a break the most. So that would help low income parents as well.
Well, Carrie, I think we could talk about this all day. It sounds like we are moving in a positive direction, and we could come up with some good solutions. The fact is, I have a bunch of kids who are waiting for me on breakfast. I could hear them downstairs, so we will have to continue the conversation later. But there's plenty for us to continue talking about, and plenty for our listeners to come to the IWF website to learn more about all of these issues and the issues related to women working outside of the home in general, and some of the policies that we advance to help those families. So thank you for taking the time to join me today. And to our listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this Working for Women podcast. Thank you for tuning in. If you want to learn more about the Independent Women's Forum or listen to more podcasts like this one, visit iwf.org.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, or stop by iwf.org for similar content.